welcome to all of you from around the world. So we're going to kick off by, first of all, introducing our first speaker, Carolyn Butler-Bowdon. Carolyn, you recently led a state-wide initiative for redefining streets in Australia. So we're really looking forward to hearing your story. So I'll ask Carolyn to share her screen.
Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. I'm just getting it on share. Hopefully you can see that. Can you see that yet?
Yes, I can see that. And if you just put it to display.
I will.
And
is that better?
Wonderful, wonderful.
Great. Well, thanks, Sandy. Thanks to the whole team that put together this series. I'm really delighted to be here. And I too would like to pay respect to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, because I come to you on land near the rocks in Sydney today. We're delighted to share our journey, and this is my team's journey. So I'm the spokesperson, but a big shout out to the Public Spaces Division for New South Wales Government. Look, like other cities and states, we all know that we had to be agile. We had to move really, really fast with what we were seeing across the globe. And of course, we needed to really focus on public space, parks, all sorts of other areas of public space that were in high demand, but particularly streets. I think Nicholas de Monchaux in the New York Times recently wrote that they are the most essential and most equal and accessible public spaces, streets. So how could we make them
I think we might go to Skye perhaps, and we'll wait for Carolyn to come back.
Sure, let's do that, and hopefully she can get back online. It would be great to see her presentation afterwards.
Skye, you've got an amazing story to tell as well, because I think I met you in 2013 and you had the original Global Street Design Guide with all the post-it notes on it, and you're in pre-production stage. Now we're post-pandemic and you've released a new version to help everyone globally through that. So can you share us your story?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much to Sandy and to Ethan and Joe for hosting today. It's a great honor to be speaking to you. I know you're coming from all over the world, but particularly to be speaking from a time zone that I'm actually awake and normal working hours, trying to keep New York hours. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to share my screen now and just check you guys can see that okay? Brilliant. So just as a very quick way, I'm going to present for about 5 minutes, very, very quickly. I'm happy to share more details on this for anyone afterwards. But as a way of background, as Sandy said, my name's Skye Duncan. I'm the director of the Global Designing Cities Initiative at NACTO, normally based in New York City. And this is a program that was launched about 5 years ago by Jeanette Sadak-Khan. Some of you may know her work from New York. And as Sandy mentioned, it's a great reminder. One of our first projects at GDCI was to create a global street design guide to really help folks reimagine what urban streets can be like. We've since had over 100 cities and organizations around the world endorse this approach of how we design urban streets. And kind of the premise behind it all is flipping that outdated hierarchical pyramid where the car has been king and we've forgotten about people, instead to put people first and to put this lens of people in place in terms of how we design our streets, and really to ask what's possible of the environments we have, of our streets, so that they can, so that they can work for more people and that they can serve more functions in this kind of very critical, limited space. I think as this audience will know all too well, that streets are our largest continuous network of public space, and therefore one of our biggest untapped assets, or our assets in our cities. And this was the lens that we've been using for our new resource, which is called Streets for Pandemic Response and Recovery. In this completely unprecedented time, we were working with practitioners and folks around the world to pull together an emergency transportation response center with funding from Bloomberg Philanthropies. And one project that emerged from that was this new resource that could collect global best practices and put that forward as a tool for folks as they span from response to recovery. So we have 6 primary principles supporting the most vulnerable folks in our communities, making sure we're amplifying local support and local public health guidance, that the moves we're making today are also shaping a better tomorrow, that we can support our local economies as they recover and respond, that we bring our communities into the process, and that we act now and then adapt over time. So in this resource, we touch on policies and practices for different contexts, but also, as we know all too well right now for many of you in Melbourne, as cities are going in and out of different phases and stages of the response of the pandemic. We also know folks have different amounts of space that they can reclaim or share, whether it's a couple of parking spots to closing an entire street. And using the materials we have at hand, from very quick, down and dirty, fast, temporary materials through to making longer term strategies. So we released in May 7 cut sheets, and then a couple of weeks ago released another 8. So we have 15 at the moment. And these kind of have a number of key themes. They're kind of individual tear sheets you can pull out. It's a free download. One is really looking at how do we ensure at this time safer movement. So more spaces for physical distancing on sidewalks, crossings, bike and roll, transit stops and lanes, but also slower streets and safer speeds. And we see examples, whether it's Milan, one of the very early movers closer to home here in Auckland, widening sidewalks, Tirana building networks of cyclists to get the young citizens out cycling. Cities like Boston doing temporary, starting with cones for transit lanes and then making that permanent. But also really great examples of rethinking crossings and intersections in France, in Latvia for safer speeds, and big boundaries being pushed in Bogota, where they dropped their entire city speed limit from 60 to 50 in response to the pandemic. Of course, another key thing is making sure folks are able to access critical services and support local economies, foods, pickup, delivery, outdoor dining, medical testing like we see in South Africa, space for tents and services for homeless communities in San Francisco, sanitation stations at transit stops in Brazil, and allowing, for many communities around the world, markets are their primary access of food. So making sure these can continue to function in a safe manner. And sometimes it's just simply reallocating that space for pickup and drop-offs. And of course, we're seeing many more examples of dining around the world. Space for recreation and exercise and play, protests and schools is another really key theme that we cover in this. So, whether it's closing streets in Berlin for kids to come out and play, or Brasilias in Brazil, the kind of ciclovia or the Sunday networks to get people out and being active, to painting and marking streets outside schools in France or in China. And of course, more recently with a lot of the protests, battling the systemic inequities that so many of us are facing, we see examples of streets being really a democratic space for expressing, protest to these deep injustices that we're seeing. And moments of celebration, whether it's from wedding or religion, we see the street as that fundamental role. So it's a very quick fly through of that resource. I encourage you to take a look. It's a free download, but just a reminder in closing to say, that it's critical that we think about the street as part of the solution to the many, many layers of global crises. So right now it is the pandemic, but we cannot forget that, we also have ridiculous numbers around road safety and air quality and climate change. So what we do know is that our cities cannot afford to return to the inequitable or the dangerous and very unsustainable patterns that we've had in the past. And that, what we're doing today, our streets are really creating kind of a foundation for our recovery for the generations to come. So I'll stop there. I know it's a bit of a whirlwind, but I'm happy to chat and provide any resources for anyone who is keen to learn more. And okay. I think you're on mute, Sandy, sorry.
Thank you so much, Skye. It's such an important resource that people can use. Can you tell us a little bit about some practice that you've observed that was really quite innovative in many ways and involved a number of different actors coming together?
Yeah, sure. I think some of the early starters, I would have to say, have been really smart at looking at what is in the pipeline already and how can they take kind of immediate quick action in response and pave the way towards a stronger recovery. So, you know, for us, certainly looking at cities like Milan, who very quickly were able to take out paint. So in that case, it wasn't chalk and cones. They actually went with paint and restriped their streets so that they could have safer walking and safer cycling. Cities like Bogota, almost overnight, I mean, in Colombia, the capital of Colombia, also were doing incredible work, not only kind of dropping the speed limit, but doing, you know, hundreds of kilometers of new bike lanes that very quickly then also became permanent. And are now, you know, stuff that cities have been looking at building out networks for, you know, that it's in the plan for the years to come. So I think that a lot of the innovation is coming where cities have already taken steps in the right direction, but this has been a very strong reminder that the safety and movement and access to critical services of their citizens is fundamental, and that actually we can't sit around and wait in many cases to get these types of changes that we need on the ground, that we have to do that very quickly.
And I'm sure we'll come back to that question of creating this as a sustainable, enduring change when we talk in the panel. So thank you, Skye. We'll come back to Caroline. She's back online.
Sounds great.
Thank you so much, Caroline, for your patience. It wouldn't be COVID if we didn't have a technical hitch.
No, I know, Sandy. I've done a few of these, and that's the first time this has happened. So apologies to all the listeners. Let's hope this works this time. So I think that you got me acknowledging country, and then I dropped out. So really what I want to say that this was our team's journey, and it has been a real team effort. And I think like other cities across the globe, you know, we had to move fast. We had to respond to public space. You know, there'd never been a spotlight shone on public space to the same degree, I don't think. And of course, streets, as Nicholas de Monchaux in New York Times recently said, are the most essential and most equal and accessible public spaces. So I think, you know, we really wanted to focus our attention on streets to accommodate social distancing, but also support business recovery. And you will see that line there, that public space is everyone's business. I stole that line from a conversation that I had in Melbourne, and I really liked it because I think it's important. It's social, cultural, environmental value, and it's also economic value. We were really lucky in the sense that we'd been given a Premier's priority not long after I started in this role. And so Streets as Shared Spaces, which is the program I'll talk about today, really fit the Premier's priority and was a natural evolution of this program. For those of you who might not know, Premier's priorities are set because they are big opportunities and equally big challenges, and they're the type of thing that cannot be achieved by one government department alone. So in a sense, it's your ticket to have conversations right across government and industry and community to really to focus on something. So ours is on access to and quality public space. So we've been using the words more, better, activated. More public space, as in new public space, better as in improved public space, and activated. Great to have public space, but how is it programmed? So you can see how we wanted to use Streets as Shared Spaces as a place to experiment. So how could we thrive and not just survive out of this pandemic? You can also see that I added bushfires in there because, of course, Australia has come out of a very extreme sort of 6 to 9 months. So that was important too, particularly when working with the regional councils. So obviously, you know, streets are a place of business and they're a place of movement, but they're equally places of belonging, connection and recreation between homes and our jobs. And of course, they're about well-being, productivity, prosperity. And they're places, I think, that merge private space and public space too. And I think often they're overlooked. You know, we often focus very heavily on buildings, I think, in our culture, and as Gail and others have pointed out, and not the spaces in between. So this program really is about those spaces in between and the connecting up. So this is our why in terms of our Premier's priority, and I think really fits streets. So, you know, why are we doing this? Why does this matter? It's everything from local character to amenity and experience. It's about physical health. It's about wellbeing. It's about community. And in Australia, of course, it's also about shade and these other really important points. So our team always comes back to the why. We like to talk about 6 moves in the team. They're quite, you know, we're looking at perhaps re-evaluating them right now, but I think that the first one is about advocacy and narrative. How do we build the story and show advocacy for leadership through great outcomes? How do we measure the value of public space? How do we focus on the unglamorous but the most critical thing, the systems change? And how can we use this window to really kind of rethink perhaps our relationship with streets? How do we move from what I call island thinking to precinct thinking, to connect up public space? There are no ideas too small. So what are the small ideas? What are the big ideas? And this Streets program, I think, does that. And how do we foster citizen and locally led initiatives while at the same time bringing big central government behind this program? So, of course, we were watching what the world was doing, and I was spamming anybody I could possibly spam in government and elsewhere about our need to move and to move really fast. And so we're grateful to the Globe for doing all this work, and Skye and others, because we were drawing on that every single day. This is our framework. Of course, we want to shift public spaces to being places, and you can see those 4 values, the environmental, social, economic and cultural, to really create those happy, healthy and resilient communities. So our program, it was clear that we really wanted to support local streets quite early on. We wanted to take advantage of the reduction in traffic on the road and the uptake in walking and cycling that we were seeing everywhere, and the joy that people were having in that. And we knew that we had to work really fast to establish the fund. So our fund is 15 million Australian dollars. It's in 2 categories. The first, the programs have to be achieved within 3 months of funding. We're announcing the funding early August, and they're more temporary projects, and they're up to $100,000. And then there's pilot projects that have to be completed within 12 months of funding, and they're up to 1 million. So I'll talk through some of the enablers and the barriers to the program. I think the momentum and strength was that the councils just rallied. We started making calls before we launched the program. What have you got? What have you seen? And so many of them had projects ready to go, but always struggled to get funding for this type of thing. We were really pleasantly surprised by state agencies joining us, and I can see there are people from the Department of Health, there are people from the Office of Sport, and obviously from Transport for New South Wales. They were critically important getting this going with us. So we pivoted really fast to produce a number of resources. They're all online and you can look at those at your leisure. But I think they were fundamental to kind of sharing our ideas and allowing people to start kind of thinking through their programs, because they had to move pretty fast. And then these were some of the others, you know, ideas and interventions. But I think the most critical kind of enabling point was our partnership with Transport for New South Wales. They just rallied and they have become a kind of triage one-stop shop. So we worked with them every step of the way, and it enabled councils to talk to them in the development of their programs. And this is a relationship that is now ongoing. Obviously, business and community also got behind it. We were also working alongside Movement and Place. This has been a project, I think, that's been developed in the past couple of years between the Government Architect's Office and Transport for New South Wales. And of course, it considers the whole street environment: footpaths, pedestrians, cyclists, deliveries, private vehicles, and so on. And really, it's a framework to help practitioners from city planners, urban designers, traffic engineers to balance the movement as well as the amenity and quality of spaces. I think what we were really taken with was that the willingness and ability and enthusiasm to be part of the program and demonstrate ideas, particularly from regional councils in particular. So that was one, and I suppose that's my way into when we did that crazy call round in the week to the launch of the program. There were people like Wagga Wagga Council, I think about 5 hours from Sydney, and they had done this amazing program that had produced 30% growth in economic return through commissioning a range of artists and creating a festival. Equally, Triangle Park Perth, you may have seen this example, how you can turn underutilised space into a real kind of community hub and a place that community wants to come together in. And of course, that's going back a few years, but its trial became a permanent success. So of course, that's the aim of Streets of Shared Spaces. Not everything will work in the program, but we're really hopeful that many of the projects can become permanent. Alongside this, we've done a process where we've asked our community to have their say. So on Social Pinpoint, they've mapped the places they love, the great streets in their area and their ideas to improve places. And we matched that with a GAL-adapted survey for Australia. And I think you can see there 89% using local streets more in their neighbourhood, incredible growth in parks, incredible growth in people walking more. You know, we know that that's the ticket to health. And so how we can really build on this and hope that Streets of Shared Spaces can help kind of continue a lot of the things that we were seeing. And the other sorts of things that we were looking at was just in that relationship with transport and their community and place team, of how we could fast track a lot of the kind of systems work or the decision making to enable those great streets, because that was what we were hearing from the community. So obviously we were working at both ends of the spectrum. So I'm going to finish on this. This is our minister. We have a very inspiring minister in New South Wales. He's the Minister for Planning and Public Spaces. And you can see there how we can focus less on roads that separate us and more on streets that join us together. And I think that's the fundamental importance of that local recovery, the local social recovery, but also the economic activity recovery, how we can work together, how we can work across state government, with local councils, and of course industry and community to create the spaces that work economically, but also bring joy and bring distinction and uniqueness, because I think that's really important and perhaps less something that's less focused on sometimes is the diversity of our streets. Every street is different, and how can we really bring out the story of places through the streets? So thank you, Sandy. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. That was just such a wonderful insight into a way to approach a very complex area where you have really responded to the leadership at the most senior level in politics, at the ministerial level, through to the people in your local communities to use the tools and processes to really deliver great places through streets. And we look forward to discussing that a little bit more in the panel. I look forward to it too. Thank you. Thank you, Carolyn. So we've heard from Skye that's talked about global design guidelines, and Caroline, who's really illustrated a statewide placemaking initiative. And now we're going to go to a very local case, which is Anna Kelderman in the City of Vincent at Leaderville Connect in Perth. And Anna is just going to give us a little taste of the story of Leaderville Connect, and we're going to pick this up again in webinar 2 on the 22nd of July. So Anna, I will hand to you, and I really want to ask you, so we've heard from Skye and Carolyn, how did Leaderville, how did they respond so quickly during COVID to activate their streets? How did you do that?
Let me explain. First of all, let me invite you to our street that was closed. So if you can see my background now, you can see, actually, hang on, let me scritch a little. I don't know, you can see the closed street behind me. That is the Leederville Town Centre closed street. So yeah, simply we responded by closing a street. So I think everyone that's starting to come out of lockdown recognises that a lot of food and bev venues are too small to actually sort of get the number of people that they would have had in previously with their square metre rates. So there was none of the venues was big enough to have outdoor space to bump into. So we bumped into the street. And you can see behind me some tables and chairs set up. That's a little bit earlier in the day before the street became a bit full. The street was closed for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 3 weeks straight, just as we were opening up the number of, opening up the venues. And then for the following weekend, it was open from Friday morning 6 a.m. through to Monday morning 6 a.m. So we really took advantage of the lack of cars moving through, but the need for our traders to have extra space. We also had really great weather at the time, so really fortunate. But you can see the venues in the image behind me wouldn't have been able to open. And in fact, in the week when the street was in fact open to cars again, some of them didn't open through the day because it was just too much. They couldn't get enough people through the door. The other thing about Leederville, I think, is everyone already recognised that connection was really important. And so reconnecting was super critical. Interestingly though, we were able to do it so fast because we've actually been on a really long-term journey with the City of Vincent and some of the key stakeholders, including our bus service, who typically runs a bus through the street. So we already had a relatively low friction environment. We've been organised as Leederville Connect for a really long time. We are just a group of local businesses and community members and retailers, but we're quite well organised, and I can't wait to share much more about that governance structure with you next time. But we've been doing years of events. So sometimes evening events, sometimes weekend events, sometimes all of week events. So we've really normalised the on and off closure. So that regular disruption makes vehicle journeys through the area a little bit confusing sometimes, and confusing is good because it means that cars kind of stop using it. And we could do this anywhere. The other thing that was, I guess, really good fortune for us, you might be able to see them, but I don't know. We have actually gone through a process of designing in this streetscape. So there are bollards at the end of this little section that's closed. And they were constructed a couple of years ago after a long journey of traffic management. Whenever everything closed, every event had a traffic management plan, et cetera, et cetera. The City of Vincent worked with Leederville Connect to do a more permanent street bollarding so that the closure could be quite easy. But what was great about that is that during the levelling of the pavement and the building of those bollards, the street was closed for 6 weeks straight. So we already had a test, and of course it was ugly because there was like Hessian bags all up and down the street, and as soon as it came down, it was just delightful. The space was amazing, and we closed it down straight away. Now, the other thing, and this is also what I'm super excited about for next time, is we've always known that when we close the street, we have this great energy. We've always known anecdotally that lots more people come in, and most of our traders, sometimes complain a little about the cars not being able to park out the front, but mostly they recognise they get a big boost. But we're just starting to collect data, which is actually telling us that they do, in fact, get a big boost of people past the front door. So now we can start to prove, even down to what sort of event does a better job. And potentially that will lead to the permanent closure of that section of street, which one of the landowners actually openly talked with me about last week.
Anna, that is I think thumbs up is the perfect place to stop. You've given so many tasty bites for the next webinar. And Carolyn, I'm sure you would see that really Anna's example is ticking all of those boxes of those the six key moves.
Yeah, definitely.
Really.
So many ideas. I've been scribbling them down, Anna, so thank you. Yeah.
So, Anna, we look forward to hearing more, as well as we've got the CEO from the City of Vincent and Dean Cracknell from 10 Town Movement at the next webinar. But I think, Anna, we'll go to Ethan now. And Ethan, it would be really interesting to hear your comments. We've heard from Carolyn, who's talked about this wonderful statewide placemaking initiative around the role of streets, and Skye globally looking at a design, and here Anna talking about the very localized example. What's significant about those three different types of place leadership that we've heard about today?
Yeah, thank you, Sandy, and thank you, everyone. So indeed, each of these stories, represents, some of the leading stories and people, thought leaders in the world on this topic. And of course, this topic, streets, is really the heart of the potential for transforming cities. As many pointed out, it's the most public space in cities. It's the space that's most contested, that needs to be contested the most. But it takes this more holistic perspective that these different leaders are sharing. We think, the focus of city building has in the past, as has been pointed out too, been on the block or the building, but not on the spaces between buildings, and how we reinvent not only how we design these spaces, but how we participate in shaping them and governing them, in structuring the relationship of government and development financing to these spaces is something we've long realized is needs to be a focus. But the challenges of today, from the pandemic, but also the big questions around race and equity, and health and climate, they're forcing this sort of in a way a perfect storm of challenges to finally address these things more structurally, more systematically. But I want to start by just thanking everyone. First of all, Sandy and Joe. I mean, you guys, I've gotten to work with you for many years and have long known and respected that you guys are the top curators of place conversations globally, and have done this globally and synthesizing these ideas. So, what I've also long thought is Australia and the leadership there offers the chance for building these sort of place-led models of governance and development that can be best replicated elsewhere. And as you guys come out of some of these crises a little faster than others, there's a little more pressure on you too to lead and show us the way, I think. So this webinar, this conversation is important for that goal. Of course, with Skye, we were last together in February at the World Urban Forum. We just launched PlacemakingX, and she launched several of her great reports there. And of course, the world changed right after that. But in a way, again, it's time for this networked learning that both of our organizations are trying to bring about. That we've been lucky to get to be connected to many people that are watching, that are also doing great things. And we need to tell these stories, we need to amplify them, connect them, synthesize the best of each model. And so it's these global perspectives that it's a time to accelerate this and think in a much more collaborative, cooperative way. And then, of course, Carolyn, I've also been lucky to get to work with recently in November last year in Sydney. You guys took these conversations to a statewide level in ways that hadn't happened anywhere around the world. And again, have showed the strength of your team and your relations across government, and your support of Minister Stokes is very inspiring indeed to raise the bar on what a state government can do anywhere. So again, the models of governance of really going down to the nitty gritty, supporting them with a great grant program, but facilitating culture change across agencies, across sectors with this place focus is a global model that I think is actually particularly relevant, and we need to help translate it to the fastest developing parts of the world as well. So we're eager to keep learning from you and exploring that as well. And then town teams and Anna, this is really, placemaking really is about supporting, connecting to, celebrating the local, the community driven, and your model is so inspiring to this. We look forward to going into it further in the next webinar. But I really hope people also learn from you and town teams. I think it's sort of the leading organizations showing how a grassroots model of governance, a multi-sector model of governance at often the street level, can turn upside down the way we participate in cities, the way the government participates. And there's so much wealth, there's such a great wealth of information and thought leadership from Dean Cracknell and and others at town teams that we want to make sure the world learns from. So just quickly closing, this has been sort of a dream of ours, a lot of these things that are happening, but we need to keep dreaming bigger. We need to keep questioning these efforts. I mean, the placemaking movement has for decades been trying to reduce regulations to allow cafes to be on sidewalks and in streets. Now all of a sudden these things are happening. We want to also make sure we're supporting vendors and not just turning inside out streets for restaurants, but other businesses, vendors, street vendors, supporting new businesses potentially, other entrepreneurship and upward mobility, social integration for new citizens in different countries as well. This bureaucracy-free zone idea is something we've long pushed for, and now we're seeing it, and now we need to figure out what's working about it and what's not. We need to have each at a very local level. We need to support conversations, debate who gets to use public space, who should use it, and then reinvent models of governance, financing, development from the place level up, and make sure we network the learning globally, locally. We ask deep questions about who's not having access to these spaces, who's in Australia's case, certainly New South Wales and Carolina have looked deeply at the Indigenous issues, not just as a challenge, but as a source of wealth for adding to the depth of place. And it's a really powerful experience. Likewise, in the States with Black Lives Matter, it's not only a big duty for us all to address these much more deeply, but if we really look at these, we're all going to have a deeper connection to history, to place, to the layers of meaning, fear, safety issues that are so front and center for many of us and need to be kept that way. So,
Ethan, that's a really important point, and it probably will segue into, we've got 5 minutes left, and Joe has done a poll on the enablers, which we'll come to in a second, but there's been some great conversation in the chat as well, and Joe's going to just unmute and ask a question. Oh, actually, so while we pose this question to you from Anthony, the panelists can have a look at this, which is the results from the what we see as enablers. So you can have a bit of a conversation about that. But Joe, there's been some great questions in the chat. Do you want to perhaps ask the one from Anthony? I can't quite see it, but you've been monitoring it.
Thanks, Sandy. There has been some great questions. Anthony was asking around I'll read it out if you can't read it from your end, but many of the placemaking options appear to reduce the capacity of the road network, as in the reduction in the number of the lanes and road closures at certain times of the day. In traditional benefit assessments, this leads to significant negative impacts on travel times, which make projects justification tricky. Does the panel have any advice on how the positives of place can be captured in a way that shows it more than the offsets of the negatives to private vehicle movements? So how do we capture those positives and offset the negatives?
So change the way that we do a business case on streets. That will be the holy grail, and I'm sure we've got some views from Carolyn or Skye. Ethan, who wants to jump in first on that one?
I'm going to jump in. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, you go, Skye.
No, Skye.
Oh no, I was just going to say, I think when we think about reducing the capacity of the street, if you actually look at the capacity of the street, private vehicles is our least efficient way of moving people. I can't remember the page number, but in the Global Street Design Guide, we've got a very clear diagram there that explains that actually by giving more space to people walking, cycling, and taking transit, we're actually increasing the capacity of our street. So I think, we do have to be careful around our terminology there, but I understand what you're saying. I understand that taking space away from cars is very controversial, and it is a really tough thing in many parts of the world. But I think the more we can bring the evidence around capacity and around movement, and the more we can measure and evaluate the impacts of projects that exist and measure different things, so that it's not just about the movement of cars, but when we do bring in qualitative and quantitative analyses, and I think Carolyn, you had a great set just on the COVID aspect there, right? The role that streets are used for so many different things. And if we don't, as Mike Bloomberg famously says, if we don't measure it, you can't manage it.
Correct.
So we've just had decades and decades of measuring the movement and speed of vehicles, and the way we can bring in the economics, the air quality, the the kind of qualitative preference of people, the road safety, the noise pollution, you know, the list, and we've got an entire section on metrics, but the list of those things that we can bring to have a fair and more equitable conversation, I think are fundamental, because it is hard. If it wasn't hard, it would already be done. But I think we've got a lot more tools now globally that we can kind of borrow and steal from each other and adapt to our local contexts.
I totally agree with that, Skye. It is evidence. And I think that's the way business cases and the rest was raised. It's about how do we use all these great projects that are happening across the globe and really measure their value, and how do we work together across countries and cities to be able to measure it. And I mean, from the little work that we have done, we have seen that the economic you know, we're talking about economic recovery, economic return for making streets, improving the amenity and the experience of streets. And of course that comes from walking and cycling and all the rest of it. But how do we measure it? And how do we measure that in statistics? And how do we measure it visually as well? Like, I'm a very big believer in telling that story visually for streets. And I think, you know, that's a piece of work that maybe we need to look to. PlacemakingX and elsewhere. How can we tell that story together and all feed in a number of examples? And I will be keen to do that with the Streets as Shared Spaces program. And evaluation is a big part of it, needless to say.
So I might transition, because we have 1 minute left, and I could just see Ethan wanting to grab hold of that conversation. But I think there's a taster, because I think the first next step is to go to Anna Kelderman and the people from City of Vincent and Leaderville Connect next in 2 weeks on the 22nd of July, because that's actually, they've got a lot of evidence and data around what happened in Leaderville Connect. So I'd be interested to share that local story together with what we've seen at state and global level. And Ethan's joining us for that conversation. Interestingly, Joe has just shared with us some of the polls that have been done. Leadership was the highest enabler, and partnerships and stakeholders was the second highest enabler. And focus on economics was actually one of the lowest, but obviously we need to do that to make it sustainable. I'm going to hand, we've got another poll, which I think Joe wants you to do, which is about barriers, but we won't discuss it. I'm going to close off the webinar, hand back to Joe so she can just do a quick wrap. But Carolyn, thank you so much for your time, and Skye for your time, and Anna and Ethan. Really look forward to continue the conversation. And our collaboration with place leaders and all the regional leaders in place in Australia is just wonderful, and we look forward to working together with you, Joanne, and the other people here. But I'll pass back to Joanne to close out the webinar.
Thanks,
Thank
Sandy.
you.
Thanks, Sandy.
Thanks, Sandy, and thank you to our panellists. I've got a couple of screens open here. We've got some amazing questions coming through. We're recording all of the questions and all of the chats, and none of it's going to waste. Sandy, I will close up, but I did notice in that very last poll that data was not considered as a very important enabler, and yet there are a lot of questions coming up in the chat around the role that we need to put a bit more emphasis on data. So I think that's a conversation that we can have in our next webinar. There have been a lot of questions coming through about, are we going to be sharing the recordings, and are we going to be sharing the slides? And the answers to that is yes and yes. So they will be on all of our websites respectively. Our next webinar is in 2 weeks. It's on the 22nd of July on Wednesday, the same time. We'll be hearing a lot more from Anna Kelderman. There was a question in here for you, Anna, and we're going to hold that till next week. We're very excited about that. It's looking at governance models and the governance role around streets as contested spaces. So please sign up for that one in 2 weeks' time, and send through any kind of thoughts or comments prior to that. But thank you to all of our audience members for sitting by and listening. And I think that we could potentially close that one up. Thanks, Sandy. I'll hand it back to you. If you want to share the last polling ones, you can. I'll end it. We're on 70%, just so the audience can see. Quickly share this.
Oh, wonderful. Well, what a wonderful thing to finish on. So we need to continue to advocate for place and for streets. People's mindsets and resistance to change, rated as 28%, the biggest barrier. If we can't change that during this time, then when can we? So let's all go back out there and do that. Thank you, Skye, Anna, Joanne, Ethan, Carolyn, and Dean.
Thank you,
Pleasure.
guys.
Thanks for
so much.
organising.
Thank you, everyone.
See you.
Great group.
Bye.
More.
Bye.
Cheers.